11:01. The meeting's in session. The Enterprise Committee meeting today to hear from Mr. Palsy and discuss the idea of the basically
we're looking to rebuild the
utility dividend.
The dividend regime.
Yeah, correct. Anyway, Mr. Palsy, it's up to you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Put together a little presentation to walk us through this. We are here today to talk about a new ordinance that we hope to introduce in the next case cycle that would change the way that we propose to calculate the utility dividends that we should be able to receive from our municipal utilities. And that would make a correction or a change to the way we calculate MUSAs, the municipal utility service assessments, which are sort of like our payments in lieu of taxes for utilities. To tell this story, I thought it would be good to begin at the beginning, and so I'm going to begin at the very beginning. So we're all familiar, especially on the Enterprise and Utility Commission, with the municipalities' utilities, AWU, MLP, and SWS. So how many utilities do we have? Of course, that is a trick question. The answer is not 3. We actually have 5 utilities. AWU operates as a single utility, but in practice and the way it is regulated is actually 2 utilities. The water side and the sewer side are distinct, water and wastewater. And likewise, solid waste is really 2 utilities. It is the disposal utility and the collection utility, or the landfill and the garbage trucks utility. And to begin at the very, very beginning then, reminder, so this is the municipality writ large, our large boundaries, but our utilities are, to the most part, not area-wide. So if you were to look at the service areas for the 5 utilities, the water utility is Eagle River, Chugiak, and a lot of Anchorage, plus Girdwood, but not all of Anchorage. The whole of the upper hillside Bear Valley is not on the water service utility system. And wastewater is nearly area-wide, but with this donut hole in the middle of the upper hillside. Likewise, MLP, this service area is well known to you, is the old city and electrical utility, so it's largely confined to Midtown and downtown, which gives us a lot of the industrial uses, the large hospital uses, and a lot of the downtown commercial areas, but it is not anything close to area-wide. The landfill likely doesn't really have a service area because it really is the landfill, and we require everybody to dump their garbage there. But the solid waste collection area is, of course, also very small and mirrors a lot of the old city service area, but even less than the old city service area. So with that general background, there is this first order question of why does the municipality writ large have these utilities that are only operating in a small subset of the municipality, and a recognition that there is a kind of tension there between the residents, voters, and taxpayers of the muni generally, and the ratepayers of those particular utilities. Why do the taxpayers and residents of Anchorage have all of this equity wrapped up in these utilities that are servicing only a subset? Well, one way that tension is historically resolved is to say that the municipality is operating those utilities for the benefit of those public, for those ratepayers, but because the residents of Bear Valley aren't directly being served by them, they're entitled to something from the utilities, and that comes in the form of a dividend, or what in the code is referred to as the revenue distribution. So like any owner of any business, the municipality is the single shareholder of these utilities, and it should be entitled to some return on its equity. And that's the way we're set up in code now. And it's totally anticipated by the state law. So the state says when we're setting the rates for all of those utilities, figuring out how much garbage collection is supposed to cost, or how much wastewater, sewer, water, and services is supposed to cost, we're entitled to include a reasonable rate of return, and those profits can be distributed back to the entity that controls the utility. So we're all wired for this. We've got it all set up. Why are we even here today talking about it? The way we've got it set up actually in the code now is if we have extra revenue, if we have surplus revenues, that's a slightly ambiguous term that I think falls out of that state statute that says that you have surplus revenues, then those revenues may, but are not required to be, pledged back to general government. But there's a limit. The total amount of the dividend that general government receives from the utilities can't exceed 5% of the utilities' gross revenues for the prior year. It's a little bit weird, right? Because we're saying if the utility has surplus revenues, we can take a dividend back from the utility, but it doesn't have to be limited to the surplus revenues. It's 5% of the gross revenues. That's the cap. So why are we talking about this subject at all? Well, there's another player in this story, and that is the RCA. So all of the municipal utilities are in some ways natural monopolies, right? So you're not going to have two sewer mains in a road. You're not going to have two electrical distributions. You're going to have brand X and brand Y water that you can potentially hook up to at your house. So if they are natural monopolies, we go back to the old Teddy Roosevelt era, we're not going to let the owner of that single natural monopoly gouge people at prices. So there's got to be some entity that's looking over the shoulder of that natural monopoly and making sure that the rates are reasonable. The RCA is that entity in Alaska, the old Alaska Public Utilities Commission, but it doesn't regulate all of our utilities. SWS is outside of their purview totally, so the collection and landfill are not on an RCA hook, but the other three, the two AU entities and MLP are. If I can digress for a little bit, that actually is a little odd. Generally, state law says public utilities that are municipally owned don't get any RCA regulation at all, and that makes some sense because the assembly is not going to let its own utilities gouge the recipients of the national monopoly services. But there is a exception to the exception in the state law that says if a municipality is operating an electric utility that competes with another electric utility, then that electric utility falls into the RCA's regulation, and any other utilities they have fall into their orbit. And I think the thinking here must have been that if the municipality is operating a utility that's competing with another, the RCA wants to make sure that we don't sort of use one of our other utilities to subsidize the operations of the first electrical utility and then undercut the other utility. It's a very hypothetical concern that I don't think has ever come to practice in reality. But it's how we fall into the RCA's orbit. There is one other exception that says the commission can just say some utilities don't need to be regulated by us if they find that's in the public interest. And that's why SWS has fallen out very long ago. They said, you don't really need to be involved in regulating our landfill or our garbage collection, and the RCA agreed. So that's the state of play then. So we have our 5 utilities, 3 of which are now under the control of the RCA. And this is a dividend discussion, so here's the hook that the RCA has. Their statutes say, if the commission finds that the capital of a public utility corporation either is impaired or might become impaired, it can order that utility to stop paying dividends until the impairment is removed. And that introduces this notion of capital structure. That means that the way the RCA looks at this is by asking what the current capital and future capital structure of the utility is going to be. That is really thought of as sort of the equity of the capital of the utility versus its debt, which means that we have these percentages that we'll throw around. That will say the utility's equity capitalization is 44%, or it's 30%, or 9% if it's pretty low.
Policy, I don't want to interrupt.
Mr. Halls, how do they define impaired or might be impaired?
We're going to get
Is
to
that
that.
arbitrary and capricious or what?
We're going to get to that. The short answer is the RCA has never and almost certainly never will say this is the number below which you may not fall. It knows it when it sees it, so when it sees equity capitalizations of 9%, says that is way too low. If it sees equity capitalizations of 90%, presumably it would say no problem. It has told us that 44.5% is fine, but it has suggested that if we project that our capital is going to fall to say 28%, that is not high enough. And more of that story will come out before we're finished.
Thank you, sorry.
So what really brought this to our attention is that as we first walked into the City Hall building in the early days of the Berkowitz administration on July 16, 2015, we got this order from the RCA where they said in a rate-making case that MLP had filed that we didn't even realize was a referendum on whether we should continue to receive dividends, we are ordering that MLP can no longer send the utility distribution back to the MOA. At the time, MLP's equity ratio was 44.5%. It said that is not impaired. But for a variety of reasons that we'll get into, they said, we're worried that it might become impaired, and so you're banned until we give you the heads up, and give you permission again later on. That is a real blow to the municipality, because the actual MLP dividends that we had been receiving up to that time were millions of dollars. So we had received the last one of $7 million, and I think we were projecting similar levels for 2016, 2017. And for those who are very fluent with the tax cap that we have in the municipality, these dividends are not taxes, so they live outside of the tax cap, which means when $7 million just disappears from the budget, there is no way to backfill that. That just is money that is a real loss that cannot be managed. It has to be managed, but it can't be easily managed. This was not the first time that the RCA had enjoined the payment of dividends. All the way back in 1980, the RCA had said both the sewer utility and the water utility are in dire straits. I don't know what their capitalization was at the time, but looking at the old records, it looked like it was almost at zero. I mean, it was like 3% on the verge of failure. And so they said, no way. Later in 1990, the utilities went back and said, can you clarify this order? We're doing a little bit better. I think the capitalizations were like 9/16 or something. And they said, no way. You're still enjoying from receiving a dividend. So the residents of Anchorage, writ large, have owned a water and wastewater utility for 40 years, and since 1980 have received no dividends from it. And MLP, this was not its first go around either. In 1987, it had a 5% equity. The RCA said no. 1990 was part of a big push to get all the dividends back. It was at 13%. And again said no. By 2005, we had done a lot better. We were at 40%. We were projecting increases. They said, all right, the dividend is restored. And then you know how the story ended most recently in 2015. You're not impaired, but we're worried that you're going to go too far and get impaired again, so dividends off the table.
Jim, Mr. Folsey, go back to that one for a second, would you please? So in 2005, they said that the equity of 40.4% was not impaired. And so in 2015, they say 44.5% is impaired.
No, and to be clear, they said 44.5% is not impaired, but we're enjoining you because you may become impaired. And there was a real difference there. In 2005, we said we're at 40% and we're only going to get better. It's going to go up as high as maybe 56%. I don't think we ever realized that number. Today, in 2015, 44.5%. They said that's where we're at now, but it is going to go down because Plant 2A is a huge new project, and it is going to push our equity down by at least 15%. It's going to come back and it's going to stabilize. We're not going to crater to zero, but that was enough to give the RCA a lack of comfort about where we were going to be.
They give you any rationale when they put the restriction on us, or just we feel you're impaired?
They said, we are confident you are not impaired, but we are worried that you might be impaired, and they were receptive to arguments mostly advanced by Providence Hospital that the ratepayers should not be bearing increased rates at a time of major capital investment, and the municipality should not be receiving a dividend at the same time.
Non-promise is a non-tax entity, isn't it?
It partially.
For the
The
most
Providence
part.
Hospital itself is a
We'll have
nonprofit.
another discussion on that.
Excuse
Thank
me,
you.
Mr. Dunbar, you have any point?
Yeah, they pay, I just looked at this when I first got on, they have $500 million in assets, give or take, they pay out about $100 million. Do they have to, is the lever that the RCA can pull simply on and off? Could they have said, you're getting a $7 million dividend, we think you should get a $2 million, we're gonna cap it at $2 million or $2.5 million. Is that an option they could have taken?
The statute doesn't speak with great clarity on that point, but my recollection is at one point they even ordered, like 1976 or something, that they ordered that the dividends from ABU would be at 40% of the maximum statute. So I don't know the answer as I stand here. Is that right, or did I make that up?
I don't remember that, but it's not clear. They generally just said yes or no.
Typically, they don't really want, I think, they don't really want to be in the role of setting that number for us. They like to play the Bring Me a Rock game, and we say, this is the rock we brought you, and they say that is the wrong rock. And they don't want to then say, here's what it should
Tell
be.
us.
Yeah, but this is a
Tell us
very heavy-handed remedy on their part, right? Completely turn them anyway. Continue, please.
Anyway, I'm sorry.
All right, so this is where we landed as of 2015. We knew there was something to be done in reaction to this, and that sent us to the drawing board. Now, how did they reach that decision? This is what we were just discussing here. Part of what happened was this was a regular rate making case. We were just setting the new electrical rates for MLP, and Providence Hospital, who's one of the biggest ratepayers of MLP, intervened and argued MLP should not be able to be paying dividends to MOA while its equity is supposed to decline, but is projected to decline below 30%. Of course, that was largely because of Plant 2A. The RCA picked up on that, and they started using that as kind of a loose benchmark. They said, you know, it looks to us like even MLP is projecting it's going to go below 30. It'll be remaining below 30 all the way to 2023. They used a figure of 28.3 is where we said it was going to level off. There is some quibbling about that number. We said in our motion for partial reconsideration that they were looking sort of only at the electrical balance sheet and not the entire assets of the utility, which would include the Blue River unit, so that number really should be a little bit higher. But suffice to say, this is where they were going. And I think this is an important factor, they said, unless we tell the municipality you are not allowed to pay dividends, we have no confidence that the municipality is going to do anything other than take 5% of gross revenues every single year. We just don't trust that the municipality can keep its hands out of the pocket of MLP. And remember, that's our calculation that's in the code now. If you have any surplus revenues, you can go up to 5%. It's not a maximum, you shall take 5%, but there was a pattern and there was a practice and some history of going to the 5% cap year after year. So that was the MLP side of the story that brought us to this proposal. There is also a woo side of the story, which is that we are in the middle of a new proceeding in the RCA with the two wastewater and wastewater utilities, and the water utility has said in its new equity management plan that filed back in March, we are been working towards a 33% capitalization goal, and we're there. And we think that we can now demonstrate that we are healthy enough to, for the first time since 1980, start paying a reasonable dividend. That puts us in a position where we have to react to the MLP decision and give, I think, the RCA some greater comfort that we are now in a place where AWU can start returning something to the municipality writ large. And that brings us to the actual ordinance that we're proposing today. And so here I'll step through what we have put on the table.
Just 1 second.
No, let me add.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. So part of this is the messaging. We want to let RCA know we are not going to unthinkingly take whatever we have said in the code is the max anymore. That historically we have just put a resolution on the table that said this amount of money is transferred from the utility to general government, and there hasn't been a whole lot of process there. And I will say I'm not sure the Assembly has gotten a great window into why the number picked was the number picked. So the first and the most major part of the new design consideration that we are proposing is to say the utility revenue distribution now has a real process associated with it. So Section 1, the utilities are now going to come to the Assembly with an actual document, a kind of Sarbanes-Oxley-like report that really says, here is where we're doing on our returns on equity, and here are the shortfalls against our old projections. Here is what we are proposing as a distribution and what that's going to do to the equity. And here is why we think that the distribution that we're proposing is a legit, prudent, consistent with business-like operation of the utility move. This is, I think, more closely aligned to the way private sector businesses work. There's no formula for how ConocoPhillips announces a shareholder distribution every year. It's sort of totality of the circumstances consideration presented to the board, and then the board picks a number which is justified. This alone, in a perfect world, would be all we need. Now we're going to have the utilities really propose a reasonable dividend in light of all of their considerations that we brought to the Assembly. This is it. That's all we would really need. But we get that there is a total lack of trust here. So we are proposing some extra bells and whistles, and this is where Mike Abbott is really happy that I included a reference to Odysseus. You may remember because I know we're all scholars of antiquities here, that Ulysses or Odysseus, when he was sailing, really wanted to hear the siren's beautiful song, but he knew if he heard the siren song, he would be incapable of rational thought, he would run out into the water and drown. So he said, "Men,
Just
tie
bear
me
with
to the
him.
mast."
To get the good stuff, you gotta get this too.
Just
So
the rest of the stuff.
just give him 5 more minutes.
So men,
It'll
tie
work.
me to the mast. I will listen to the song and I won't jump in the water. So we too now will say, if you believe general government is incapable of hearing any whispers of money from the utility without taking it all, tie us to the mast. So we will not take all of their money. We will limit ourselves to 75%, not of now of gross revenues measure, but the utilities change in that position, which is the technical term for how we conceive of profits here. If you're making profits, we'll limit ourselves to those profits, and we are going to leave some of those profits on the table no matter what. 75% of the profits is all we're going to make available for the distribution.
And we're not asking to remove us from RCA consideration.
No.
So you're still there, and if we screw up, punish us.
I mean, well, we have no
We would
ability.
say that.
Right, so we're not asking to be removed from RCA regulation generally, and we don't even have the ability to say, ignore your own powers to enjoy our dividend.
Sure.
if we-
We're just giving you more information.
We're just giving you more information, and this itself is potentially commercially unreasonable. So if you look in the real world outside of municipal government, look at like ConocoPhillips, our neighbor. In 2015, they lost $3.5 billion in the fourth quarter and $4.4 billion over the year. There were no net profits, and they still paid a dividend. And that happens consistently across private sector. But we're really saying, okay, if we need to do some extraordinary things here to give you comfort that we're not going to go crazy, and even if it might be commercially reasonable for us to pay a dividend in a year that we lost money in the utility because we're projecting great profits in future years, or because we think in out years the capital structure is going to grow really high, we will leave that money on the table for this year. We do have one safety valve though, which is to say, if the utility has already grown its equity to sky high, way above 65%, then you might be able to declare an extraordinary dividend and say there's sort of too much money now tied up in this utility. Or if the RCA ever tells us a number, and this hasn't happened, it's probably not likely to happen, but if they ever say a reasonable range of equity for any particular utility is 25 to 55 or 25 to 60, then we'll maybe do some extraordinary dividends to get us back into the range. And even in those scenarios, we would want the utilities to explain in writing why the extraordinary dividend is prudent, business-like, worthy of consideration. And then, if that were not enough, we're going to say, here's some per se rules. We'll get no dividend in, this is repetitive, if we haven't made any money. If we didn't make any profits, we're not going to take a dividend. We're also not going to take a dividend if we are at an equity percentage which the RCA has found to be impaired. Now, we don't know exactly what the highest level is, what the lower bound of the consideration, but we do know from having the dividend joined a few times that 9% is too low, 13% is too low, and if they ever told us what the real number is, we can use that number. Or we'll say, look, proactively, we're not going to do it unless the utilities are at least 30% capitalization. Now, why do we pick that number? Because now we've actually picked a benchmark that says we're not going to let the utilities get wider than 30%. Partly, it is in recognition of the fact that that seemed to be what was moving both people who were throwing arrows at us in the last RCA proceeding with MLP. That was the number Providence used, and because that was the number that the RCA seemed to be stuck on. They were worried that we were going to fall below 30. But also because we have pretty good confidence that 30 is above whatever actual impairment is. So we had experts testify in that proceeding and said, even utilities across the country with equity ratios as low as 22% still have investment grade bonds. And if you look at our peers, we're way above all of our Alaska peers. So if we're just trying to get the RCA some comfort, we say, look, we're not going to pay if we fall below 30%. We think that is a pretty unambiguous and hard to argue with signal that we are not impaired and we're not going to be impaired. So 30%, that's the number we picked, and that's a significant design consideration in this ordinance. Likewise, if you want to do the sort of the commercially reasonable way, we won't be paying dividends if suddenly Moody's or S&P is now telling us that our bonds are junk bonds. Or if ever, of course, the RCA says you can't pay a dividend, we'll obviously comply with that order. So that's the major design considerations. The very last one is also an equally important one is the Assembly has to, of course, approve all this. So we're proposing then this new process, a real, rigorous, thoughtful process. The utilities themselves say, this is what we think is commercially reasonable. Here's the justification. Here's a clear-eyed view of what it's going to do to our equity and what we think it's going to do to our equity in the future, how we've performed in the past. We've got these safeguards, and we've got ultimate Assembly approval, which we hope to give the RCA some comfort to lift its current restrictions, and in the future would put us in a better posture as we're in front of the RCA, where we say, this sort of more of an administrative record here. Thoughtful people have done some real thinking, and the RCA should hopefully give some credit to that process. And there's one last piece of the dividend of this ordinance that I'll describe, and then we'll be done. I can take some questions. And that is that we propose to change a portion of the way the MUSAs are calculated. So by way of reminder, all of our utilities are government owned, so they don't have to pay property taxes, but they have lots of net plant all across the municipality, which if they were privately owned would be paying property taxes. And most of the MUSA is calculated like a payment in lieu of tax, like a PILT. We just say, whatever service area in, or take that mill rate and we'll apply it to your net classified plant. But the MUSA for a very long time has also had this additional feature, which says, in addition to what feels a lot like applying a real bogus property tax to your net plant, the utilities are also supposed to be paying 1.5% of their actual gross operating revenues. I have not gone back and researched the original justification for why that is, but it means that we have this two-component formula in the code, something that feels like a pill and something that feels a little bit unlike a pill. And the RCA has a definite view of this. In 1990, when AWU went back and said, can we get a dividend back? They threw in this kicker that said, and just to clarify, that weird portion of your MUSA that's calculated as 1.25% of your gross revenues, that certainly feels a whole lot like another hidden dividend. And since we have ordered you to stop paying dividends from your actual revenues, we're ordering you to stop paying that part of the MUSA too. We can live with that. So the last part of this proposal is to just get rid of all of this. So we're not going to have the weird 1.25% figure at all. It'll be a clean pill. The MUSA will be exactly like the property tax. And that is the ordinance that we put in front of you. There's one last piece of this puzzle. What I hope could give the RCA some additional confidence that this isn't all a scam is that as we go back to them in the AWU proceedings, if the Assembly were to adopt this ordinance, we would now be in a posture saying, we're not going to declare a dividend unless we make some money and we're above 30%. And in the same breath that we have said that that is a theoretical possibility, we're saying the actual request from the wastewater utility is that we are shooting for over 33, and we're actually at 33 right now, but we don't want a dividend because we don't think it's commercially reasonable for the wastewater utility to do that right now. So ideally, in a perfect world, this would be a trust-inducing thing where you say, look, there is now this maximum possibility in the code which we think should give you great comfort, and we are not going to just blanketly scoop up all the money. When it doesn't make sense, we're not going to do it. So that's what I have prepared, and we're happy to answer questions. Smarter people in the room will have answers.
So just a process thing, our plan at this point is to introduce this ordinance for the Assembly's consideration on the 27th. So it'll be in your packets next week. And then hopefully it would be set for public hearing at the July 11th Assembly meeting for public hearing and Assembly action.
Any background presentation that might go with that ordinance when it's presented?
Well, certainly we'll write an assembly memorandum. Have it done yet.
Okay.
And I
As long as there's a public document.
The shorter version of the story.
Okay. A couple of questions here. Dunbar, I think was.
Yeah. So I have two questions. The first one actually just came to me as you were talking about us not taking an AWU dividend. You say we. First of all, who is we? And under this ordinance, as we pass it, and maybe you can point to the language, under what authority do we have to not take a dividend? Right? There's this formula that spits out dividend. How can we say, no, we're not taking it this year?
So we is general government. And right, so the assembly every year passes different kinds of budgets, utility budget and the general government. The distributions have only ever and can only ever flow from utilities to general government, which means that they become area-wide dollars to be used for any purposes. So when we're talking about taking a dividend, the loose characterization of we, that is the municipality writ large in the form of the general government budget. The authority for not taking a dividend is the authority that has always existed, which the statute as it exists on the books now is completely permissive and says you may take a dividend up to this amount. The RCA has said every time you were theoretically capable of taking that amount, you took all of that amount. But likewise, so let's see, if it has it, those may be pledged by inclusion to the general government budget, and we're keeping in substantial form that it's always a case-by-case, year-by-year decision in light of what makes sense. There's never an automatic check.
Then as a follow-on to that, you, the administration, can tell the RCA we're not taking this dividend, but then if we pass a budget that has a dividend in it, we'll take a dividend, right? I mean, in some ways, isn't our promise to the RCA a little bit illusory?
Well, then we have to move forward.
Well, so the state of play is that the RCA has standing orders that say AWU in the form of both of its utilities and MLB cannot take it. So we definitely will not even propose a budget that incorporates either any of those three dividends because we know they're unlawful to pay. The way it would actually have to play out is that if you were to pass this, we would then go back to the RCA at the appropriate time in the various utility circumstances and say, please lift that dividend restriction. And then somewhere in the future, we would propose a budget that includes potentially a utility revenue distribution. And the RCA would never act on that. They would only, in some future RCA proceeding, again take a look at the capital, the equity, and make a decision about whether or not they could again turn the spigot off.
Okay, so I guess regardless of whether they trust you or trust us when it comes to that budget, you're just making kind of a promise to the RCA, right? I mean, that we aren't going to ask for a dividend next year. There's nothing in here that restricts us from doing that.
Well,
from AWU specifically.
so in the specific case of AWU, and these are the real experts, so they'll correct me if I'm wrong, we have already filed documents in March where we've said, please set new rates for the two services, the water service and the wastewater service. And in those rate-making cases, we say the rate is reasonable for a whole variety of reasons, and here's our equity management plans, which are going to show what the equity of the utility looks like. In the case of the water utility, we said our equity management plan assumes that we are going to start paying a dividend to MOA, and it will even be at the whole maximum amount. And we still think all of that works out. The equity management plan for the wastewater utility says we are building this on the assumption that we are not going to ask for a dividend. And even further, it says we're requesting respect to the capital structure. We can go all the way down the rabbit hole there. But suffice to say, I think we are not even asking them to lift the dividend restriction as to wastewater, and the rate-making case would be asking them to lift it as to water, as I understand.
One clarification, we have not actually filed a formal petition to lift the dividend restriction on water yet. We filed an equity management plan basically stating we're planning on doing it.
And it's contingent on this ordinance passing, because we want to tell the RCA, the first time the RCA will see this new proposal in front of them is likely to be the water utility filing that we're planning to make later this summer, which is why we're hoping for assembly action in the next 30 days.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask one more follow-up?
Sure.
Thank you. So this is all great. I mean, I really like how you went through it. It all makes perfect sense to me. And so, take this in the spirit in which it's intended. Why are we just not proposing this now? Is there something that's changed or happened? We've kind of known about this issue with the RCA for about 2 years. Is it simply a case of this is a very technical ordinance, it took a long time to reach this point, or has something changed? I mean, why didn't we do this in August or September of last year?
There are a lot of ways to answer that question, but the bulk of it really was that it was capable, and we did hash out a lot of different alternatives before settling on this one. The other was there was some question about exactly when to surface this and to put it back on the RCA's radar, and there was an initial thinking that we might tie it to an MLP proceeding, but then those timelines all changed, and now I think we want to get ahead of the ARU procedure. I'm not sure the clear answer to that. I can also pivot away from stop shooting around the answer to that question. Also, it looked like Brett had something else he wanted to say.
Actually, I forgot what that was, I think.
You were talking about the dividend restriction.
Oh, yes,
Request
the equity management plan that we filed in March is not approved by the RCA. It's an informative document, so that there isn't a commitment or necessarily even an expectation from RCA that we would follow that plan to the letter. But it's provided for us kind of a segue into the idea that we would be asking for a lifting of the dividend restriction in order to make that happen. But we would wait until this action's in place before we do that, so that we could lean back on the assembly action and your support.
So just heads up reporting, give them a chance.
And just to follow on to Mr. Dunbar's question, the place in which this would really be a decision point for the Assembly is likely to be in the approval of the utility budgets through the budget approval or first quarter revision process, where they would have a line in their budget that says dividend. And that would be the place where the amount would show up. And then in the general government side, it doesn't show up in an appropriation way, but there will be a revenue source that'll say, $2 million from water, X million dollars from MLP, Y from solid waste, et cetera. So that's not really an appropriate, there's no line for the Assembly to move around in that document, but in the utility budgets, there will be. That is a line, and that is in the appropriation, typically the annual appropriation that you'll make.
If I may, just one quickly, and Mr. Train's got a question also, but in terms of, is the proposal that we're making consistent with the competition, if you will? Because we do have competition with regards to water systems. And so how does that compare in terms of what they take and their rate structure and so on and so forth?
So I think I can answer that question in two ways, both of which are somewhat inadequate. I think, so it is consistent first in the sense that we don't understand, my recollection, and I don't think this has changed, is that the RCA has not enjoined the dividend from being paid from any of these other utilities. For some weird reason, they sort of started at the top. Maybe that just means more shoes are going to drop and every time everybody else walks in front of them, they're going to get dividend restricted. But I think we're consistent with our peers in terms of sort of the capitalization levels that we're targeting through this proposal. The second way of answering your question, and this is where I'll defer to other people who might be able to really bring me in, I don't think anybody else has a formula or the same kind of process that we have at all. I don't know how the other utilities, Homer, Matt Newsgood, Golden Valley, calculate their dividends, but if they're privately held, I suspect it just happens in a boardroom. There aren't a lot of rules, but maybe somebody can
It
do more
is,
about that.
the cooperatives are member-owned cooperatives, and so they have capital credits that are billed by year and that are owed to the owners at that time. And so it could be that, the capital credits are from 20 years ago, and when they pay them, the person is no longer a member, but they still pay that capital credit to the individual. And it is a board decision. And in theory, the board members that are directing the cooperative are elected by the members of the cooperative. So they, in theory, they have a skin in the game if they want to be reelected, and that they are looking out for the best interest of the members.
I know that I'm in a private water system, and I know that we have to submit our rate structures to the RCA for review. Or maybe we just do it, but they do review it, and I just didn't know what the comparability was between.
Historically,
Do they pay
and
tax?
it goes back 20 years when I
Do those
was doing this.
organizations pay tax?
They did file a rate case, but for smaller water systems, it's a much smaller rate proceeding.
Well,
And
less payers too.
yes, and so the owner, and it was generally an owner as opposed to all of the people that were certified system, would project the return, and then they took the return that they wanted to, as long as their equity stayed above a certain percentage.
It'd be nice to understand if there's comparability in terms of cost, private versus public. There would be property tax included in that, and rates. And I know scale and stuff. Anyway, Mr. Chairman.
Barbara, would you set a work session out, Rules Committee, committee of the whole on this ordinance as a member deal? I want to make sure that every single member here is not
Yes.
repeating ourselves twice.
I agree.
So if you set that, because right now we're doing that 3 year. I want a full assembly here, so when Mr. Halsey's going through this again, you guys are talking about this again, I want all assembly members to understand the numbers, so we're not filling around this other meeting. Another thing, Mr. Abbott, I asked you when this came down in 2015, if we were going to appeal it. What's the appeal process for appealing a lock on our dividend? And why didn't we appeal it?
So I can answer that question. So we filed a motion for partial reconsideration of the RCA's order, and we fully laid out the case. We thought it was procedurally unfair that they did this to us because we had no advance notice that they were even considering whether to join the dividend. We thought that we actually had presented enough evidence, even notwithstanding that we didn't expect that this was part of the proceeding, that should have pushed the RCA to the conclusion that we were not impaired and we're not going to be impaired. This table came, both of these things came out of that motion for reconsideration. We said compared to our peers, we're doing well better than everyone else. You haven't joined them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The RCA summarily rejected that motion for partial reconsideration. The order, I think, said the initial order is affirmed. At that point, we could have appealed to Superior Court, but our judgment was that the odds of prevailing were low because that puts a single Superior Court judge in the position of saying, I know better than the technical expert regulatory authority as to whether or not a utility's capital may become impaired. We thought the odds of winning were very low. And further, that to the extent of this evidence that we had somewhat strained relationships with the RCA, that it might further stretch those lines of communication. So there wasn't a lot to be gained from appealing. The better shot was we made a decision not to go forward with it there, but rather to delay it to a future rate case filing or a future RCA proceeding where we could go back to them with some kind of new story, not just pounding on the table and saying, you really messed this up. To say, we've heard you, we have thought, we've carefully considered what you have now told us, and we have something that is responsive. And oh, by the way, all the facts that we wanted to present in that last case are still true facts, and so all of that should lead you to a new level of comfort.
Mr. Johnson, Mr. Harris, anything to add?
Mr. Chairman, I think,
You're saying it's great. You guys did a good job in terms of coordinating or structuring and.
yes. So with respect to this, I think this is. I think this will be very helpful for us as we move forward in an effort to get back the dividend for our utilities. I think it's a smart business approach. Serving on a board of a for-profit corporation as I do, investment decisions are based upon what we can receive in terms of return. That's where the money goes. We put money into things we know we're going to get money back on, and if we don't get that investment return on, we don't plow any money into this. And this is an ongoing business enterprise that deserves to have investments made into it. So I think this captures that, and this, I think, positions us well for going back to the RCA and for us internally planning on how we would structure and determine investments.
I think that in answer to your question and possibly one of the earlier questions, this is something that has been worked on for quite some time, and we have looked at a number of different possibilities. We believe that this is a part of the effort to regain the dividend from the RCA. We have instituted some fiscal discipline policies at ML&P related to operating and capital decisions that are made. We have modified the EMP, which AWU had filed one. We've modified ours, and that will come before the Assembly to take a look at. We will then file that modification with the RCA to show that we have heard what they have said, we understand their concerns, and this is what we're doing to try and address their concerns, to give them a greater level of comfort so that they can then make that decision to allow us to repay or start paying the dividend again.
And one more, what's MLP think, or AWW?
I guess the concern I have is that the ordinance makes it dependent on the utility management to propose what the dividend level might be. At first thought, I would think that in operating a business, I would prefer to put the money in the business and not to the shareholders necessarily. So we would have to craft a thoughtfully constructed argument for what the right dividend would be, and I think that there are allowances for that. And there will be a lot of work that we'll be doing with respect to looking at a number of financial metrics and looking at trying to preserve our standing with the rating agencies, and preserve our standing in equity management so that we can put that forward.
Mr. Ring,
Yeah, well, it actually raises an interesting question. I mean, do you have any response to that, Bill, about what Brett kind of laid out there is people that are going to be paying it are the ones that are really proposing it, but they do have that incentive. I mean, what logical reason can they give except sort of wanting to please the administration or the assembly to pay a dividend like this?
Yeah, I think that services what we hope will be the new healthy tension that A4 and the utilities, because the historic practice was the A4 might as often as not wake up and say, we want you to give us everything in your wallet up to the limit that is prescribed in the code.
Yeah.
And there wasn't a formal opportunity to force a conversation about what appropriately balances the right of the municipality writ large to receive some return for operating the utilities which are operating only in a subset of the municipality, and what the real business needs of the utility are. So I bet that is a brand new dynamic that is forces internally in the municipality, where Mike Abbott sits down and says, boy, it sure would be great if we could get X million, and Brett says, you know, the best interest of the municipality is actually that minus something. And then there's a serious considered process that results in a joint recommendation. When the utilities are recommending to the municipality, that's the result of an internal conversation with the administration. But what you get then is hopefully something that says, this makes sense for everybody. The municipality didn't just sweep up all the cash that was in the cash account. And the utility said, well, we are owned by another shareholder, and we've returned some kind of dividend. I mean, and that tension exists in the private sector too, right? ConocoPhillips can say, we're not paying the dividend anymore, we're actually pretty cash strapped right now. But they understand that there are responsibilities that people put a lot of resources in these matters.
And I think that it is also incumbent upon us as managers of the utility to make the case, to actually not only in paying or not paying the dividend, but in the decisions that are made related to operating the utility, as well as decisions that are made in the rates that we ask for. You know, making sure that we actually get close to our return on equity, because that's really where the dividend comes from, is the equity of the utility. And if we go through a thoughtful process in looking at financial metrics, projections as to where we expect the utility to be, and we make a recommendation And, you know, in that written report that is required, you are correct that the assembly could look at that and say, you know, yeah, but no, we're gonna do some other number. But then it becomes incumbent upon the assembly to say, the reason we're going to do some other number is because of this. And so we have set up a process whereby people have to, whether it is the management of the utility, the administration, or the assembly, have to justify the decision that is made, and then the RCA has the ability to go back and look at that justification, and they either agree with it or they don't agree with it, but at least there is more of a record on which we can then potentially, as Mr. Trainee said, take it to the next step. If they say no, we have a record that we can then go to the court and say, this was the record before them, they said no, we think the answer should have been yes.
Great. Can I ask another question? Chairman, so this is actually a question for you, Dick, on this administration. So are you guys proposing this for the meeting on the 27th? Is that when this will be introduced?
Introduced at the 27th.
And then, Dick, do you want to have the
I
rules
want to have
committee
before
before that?
committee, probably after that. I'll talk to Barbara after this, we can do it. But I want rules committee, because I want every assembly member here, so we're not repeating ourselves multiple times.
So, first of all, I'd like to ask for the excuse from that rules committee meeting, because I came here. We have a rules committee meeting next Friday. Maybe we want to go back to back on that.
Barbara?
I have the dates for you and the times. So
When?
the options would be, and I would of course make sure the administration is available. Forrest has a proposal for a meeting from 1:30 to 2:30 next Friday. Have you decided you want Friday or Thursday for the
I
choke
think
cherry?
Dick preferred Friday, so
Friday.
Friday in general is
So
better.
I'm afraid next Friday, if you did it, because we're also gonna do the HLB amendments, so that means it would be at 3:30 to 4:30.
That's fine.
Well, why can't we do a little bit earlier? Like, why are we starting things on the half hour? Why can't we start things at 11 or?
Well,
Let's do a series of-
I will tell you that you could start earlier on next Friday.
Shift everything at 11 noon.
What time are we
one,
starting?
two.
We have an assembly aid open house that
Okay.
starts at 10:30, so that would be awful early. The other options that I have, depending on the administration's availability, Thursday, June 29th from 11:30 to 12:30, that would be good.
Let's do it after the 27th, Barbara.
This one.
This work session, do it after the 27th. Be introduced for the 27th. When's next Friday we can have a work session?
That would be on the 30th, which is before the 4th of July weekend. Or you could do it on Friday, July 7th at any time.
Mr. Abbott, your choice?
Mr. Falsey, you're around. Mr.
Either-
Johnston, Mr. Jokel. I think we can make either of those Fridays work. We'll
So-
leave it to you guys to decide.
Friday, June 30th? or
Sorry, July 7th.
Oh,
July
so
7th, Barbara.
June 30th. He said he's
You
out.
like June
July
30th, Mr. Folsey?
I'm checking my calendar, I'm
Okay.
pretty positive I'm not in the state.
It is July 4th weekend, so. people
Yeah,
are-
I am gone July 4th through July 12th-ish.
So we request June 30th.
Okay, Barbara, put down
Okay.
June 30th.
June 30th, we'll do it at 12 o'clock noon till 1,
Yeah.
okay?
Get it done.
Okay, just a couple observations.
I got a question from administration.
You do?
Yeah, one question.
Okay, go ahead.
You said Providence Healthcare filed against the city in this case. Did Alaska Regional join with that, or did they not do the same thing?
In the case where the
RCA.
dividend was restricted,
Right.
it was Providence and the federal executive agency, basically the basis. In our current case, it's Providence, ANTHC, the Native Hospital. Alaska Regional has not been involved in any of our cases that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, that's all.
I like the way you structured it. I like the code changes in terms of giving the logic and rationale, the boundaries. And I hope RCA concurs with that. I think in the past, they felt that they were guardians against the fact elected people are fine, they're elected by the people, but they're also short-lived. to some extent. And so I think by putting it in the regulations that we have, that will help to, hopefully, help to keep other administrations from mucking with it, and we have rationale, and so they ought to be appreciative of that and approve what we're doing. But good food for thought, good rationale, and we'll see where it goes. Anything else? For the good of the order? Or not?
Please
Yes.
turn in your cheat sheets for tours.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We've got the AV review tour.
I should
Do you wanna
have, I should have done an
announce the other
announcement. We've got, July 20th as the next regular meeting, and, or that's the tour of the ML&E plant tubing.
Not on the 20th, I
No, it's
believe.
not.
20th is your meeting. The 13th is our grand opening.
I'm sorry.
Which I hope all of you will be at to tour the facility, but also we're going to have a little bit of food.
Right, I just didn't complete my notes to myself. So the next meeting is going to be on the 20th, but the tour of MLP Plant 2A, I would recommend, I have taken a tour, but I have not taken it since it's been complete. And so I'm looking forward to it, and hope folks will take advantage of it. Then the August meeting is tour of Mural Field. That's what we're talking about, and that'll be a shuttle tour. We'll have a van and run from here. Right?
If you request one, Mr. Steele, I will ask the administration if we can do that.
Yeah, I'm just worried about Mural Field is kind of a closed complex, so it works with a van to take a tour around. There's a lot of things in the van as opposed to.
We start the budget committee.
Pardon me?
Need your meeting.
The meeting is ended.